Good morning, everybody. Happy Sunday. And amidst the lot of compulsory rest in the guise of lockdown, and we are assembled here for the purpose of learning subjects, especially in the field of law, from various resource persons. And Lex webinar series enters the 58th lecture series today. And today's chief guest is, if I use the real words, not believing in flattery, an young and dynamic personality, Miss Aishwarya Bhatti. She finished her schooling in Kendriya Vidyalaya Air Force, Jodhpur till 1992, and she finished her BSc from KN College, JNB University, Jodhpur between 1992 and 1995, and she obtained her law degree from JNB University, Jodhpur between 1995 and 1998, and needless to say that she was a gold medalist in the law university, and she finished her PG in law from the same university from 1998 till 2000, and she was an advocate on record of the Supreme Court of India for 13 years prior to her designation as a senior advocate, and her professional standing is 22 years as of now. She was she was designated as the senior advocate of the Supreme Court of India in March 2019. And so far, only 12 women lawyers have been designated senior advocates. And Ms. Aishwarya Bhatti holds the record of being the youngest woman to be designated senior counsel, senior advocate so far. And currently, she has been recently appointed as additional Solicitor General to the Union of India and the Supreme Court of India. And she has been an additional advocate general for the state of UP in the Supreme Court, and she is the counsel for the High Court of Delhi in the Supreme Court, and she's a panel A lawyer for Union of India, and she's a panel lawyer of Supreme Court of India Legal Services Committee, Supreme Court Middle Income Group Legal Aid Committee, and amicus curiae in various cases. And her miscellaneous activities would include secretaryship of the prestigious SCBA in December 2013, and again in 2014 with a record margin. And she regularly participates in television debates and deliberations and national conferences on myriad legal issues of national importance relating to administration of justice and women's rights. And she was adjudged as the best student associate advocate of the country in the All India Moot Court competition organized by the Campus Law Center in the year 1998. So the list goes on and on and on. With this warm welcome, may I now request Ms. Aishwarya Bhatti, ASG, Senior Advocate, Supreme Court of India, to commence the deliberation. Ma'am, you are welcome, and the forum is yours.
Thank you so very much, sir. Very kind and generous welcome and beautiful words that you have said about me. So the topic that is assigned to me today is the March of Gender Justice under the Indian Constitution. In fact, the Constitution coming into force itself was a huge landmark and a huge pivotal moment for gender justice. We have to bear this in mind that we are talking about a time which was 70 years before. And just 100 years back, women did not have the right of franchise. There was no universal adult franchise even in the most developed countries. In fact, that is a battle that women have won in the most developed countries, the most, what we understand today as countries which are, or always they have proclaimed themselves to be countries which have been flag bearers of liberty, justice, equality. Even those countries did not think it appropriate to grant the right of vote to the women of those countries. And right to vote is such a significant, fundamental, basic right, because it's not just, when we have a right to vote, oftentimes we don't put too much of attention or too much of focus on that. But not having a right to vote actually means that political emasculation. There is disenfranchisement. So there is, when you are not a voter, then you have no economic, social, there's no focus on you, because the politics of vote banks is what governs the world today. Let's face it, that is the reality. So from there, that journey started for women. Gender justice issues also, interestingly, they transcend barriers, they transcend boundaries, they transcend geographies, and it may differ in the point of time, that women have fought these battles at different times across geographies, but it's the same kind of battles that need to be fought. Therefore, I'm starting my sharing my opinions from that point in time, where 70 years ago, our founding fathers did not even bat an eyelid, did not even give a second thought, and started with universal adult franchise. Equality was ingrained, but it was recognized, it was conceptualized in part 3 of the Constitution. They went a step further. When the whole world was talking about equality 70 years ago, our founding fathers thought it appropriate to have have special benefits for women and have the concept of affirmative action, which is very strongly enshrined in the part 3 of the Constitution itself. Because our equality, the equality the way it is understood in under our constitution, is equal treatment of equals. The constitution makers were well aware of the fact that women, because of the thousands of years of persecution and harassment that they had faced at the hands of the patriarchal society and the stereotypes in the society, if they would be given equal protection of laws, it would actually amount to perpetrating inequality. Therefore, the concept of affirmative action was thought of and was specified, so that affirmative action can be taken by states for women, children. Then there are other backward classes also that are prescribed. And we've seen how the whole chain has gone of affirmative action. Now it goes to the economic aspect of it. That is actually the basis of. So I'm going to briefly speak about the provisions which exist in the Constitution with regard to gender justice. The most important was that universal adult franchise. We started with that. We started with equality and affirmative action in part 3 of the Constitution. It is very specifically enshrined in Article 15, Article 15.3 specifically. 14 is a general equality clause. Then Article 16, which specifically prescribes that in matters of public employment, it will be complete equality. And then there are some very interesting provisions which are there in the directive principles of state policy, because everything could not be included at the time of promulgation of the Constitution. Therefore, a lot of aspirations of the nation were included in part 4 of the Constitution, which is the directive principles of state policy. And specifically, the specific rights which are there are Article 39A, which requires the state to direct its policy towards securing for men and women equality, the right of an adequate means of livelihood and equal pay for equal work for both men and women, both 39A, 39D. Then 39A, equal justice and free legal aid. 42 is with regard to just and humane conditions of work and maternity relief. Maternity relief is also something that is very, very important, because for professional working women, often the biological clock and the biological journey, it actually contradicts with the journey that you are undertaking as a professional, that you are undertaking as a working woman. And if sufficient safeguards are not available in the form of maternity relief, maternity leaves, childcare leaves, etc., then the child is also neglected, and the mother is forced to choose between her profession and choose between her child, which is a very unfair choice for any woman to be thrust upon. So these, seemingly it may seem that it's a small thing that maternity relief was given, but this, you ask any woman who's working and who's a mother, you will understand that this is not a choice that they like to make. In fact, I must share from my own experience that in Supreme Court, we did not have creche earlier. The creche was actually installed in Supreme Court. We had it functioning in the time that I was the secretary. I had the honor of playing some little role in that. Of course, it was all the Supreme Court's magnanimity to include it. But before the creche was there, of course, now we have a much better creche. Now, at that time, it was a stopgap arrangement that was done in, some portions, some rooms that were vacated in the chamber block, and the facility was put in. And when the new building, the additional annexy building of Supreme Court got constructed last year, then we have now a full-fledged, in fact, 2 years back. So now we have a full-fledged creche with a good, nice garden and everything, all facilities, everything. And now we see that more and more courtrooms, this facility is coming. But to give you an example, many of my colleagues, I of course had children very early in the profession. When I was a young lawyer, I was already a mother of two, and I also had my share of issues, and trying to. At one point in time, I was actually contemplating whether I should continue with the profession. I had twins, and it was my mother's caution. She said that if Rani Lakshmibai could go to the battlefield with her child tied around her back, then why can't you go to the profession? If you have chosen to do litigation, then do it along with your children. So that was my story. But many of my friends used to bring their children in the cars in the Supreme Court compounds. The children used to be sitting in the cars with a nanny or the driver. The air conditioning in the car would be on. And it was only, if you will remember, that a huge scare was raised with regard to, in static cars, air conditioning being on for a long time. And that was actually creating some poisonous gases, which was leading to fatalities. So we raised all of these issues. Many of our colleagues played very instrumental part in having that. And establishment of the creche, it has actually allowed women lawyers and women of the registry, women in the judiciary to actually not make this sad choice of choosing between having a child or taking care of your child. No mother wants to make this choice, and no professional wants to make this choice. So maternity relief and maternity benefits, which were there in part 4, of course, have now gone on to the statutory rights. But this was very significant for any working woman. So I just wanted to take a detour and explain. Then there is also Article 44 is also very significant, because it prescribes uniform civil code, which has continued to elude us as women of this country. And somehow, even after 74 years of independence, we've not been able to have uniform civil code. But Article 46 talks about special care, educational, economic rights for weaker sections, and rights against exploitation. Then there are several rights in that: practices derogatory to dignity of women, which is Article 51A. Then the major challenge, the major significant change that happened was including women in the share of power. That was the 73rd constitutional amendment that was included. And in grassroots politics, in the panchayats across the country, there was a provision made for reservation of women in 1/3 of the constituencies by rotation, etc. And this was a very significant step. Of course, this is also it's just remained there for the grassroots politics. It's not trickled up as it ought to have done in the parliament and the assemblies. But that was 73rd amendment was a significant provision in the constitution. Now I want to take you through the journey of constitutional interpretation. These are the specific provisions which do specifically affirm and protect gender justice in the Constitution. But it is the journey of the Constitution is not a static document which stays as it is, and it's it is like law. It is like life. It changes meaning every day. In fact, in a very landmark judgment, the Supreme Court has gone on to say that fundamental rights are like empty vessels, and every generation fills in its own wisdom in those empty vessels. So the interpretation of Constitution, the journey of interpretation of Constitution has been very dynamic. It has been a very interesting journey. And gender justice is something, Supreme Court has been like a lighthouse, for the march of gender justice. So I'm going to take you through some of the significant judgments during this whole process, during this journey. Initially, if we see the early judgments, that the early problems that the Supreme Court was confronted with, some of the cases are very interesting, where in one case a particular provision of law was challenged, which actually required that women employees needed to take permission. They needed to take, this was the validity of Indian Foreign Services Conduct and Discipline Rules of 1961, which were challenged in CB Muthamma versus Union of India, where a female employee was required to obtain a written permission of the government in writing before her marriage was solemnized. So this, I mean, imagine this is how it started. The Supreme Court, of course, struck it down. It said that it cannot be done. That you have this kind of a condition only for women. You cannot have these kind of stereotypical behavior and for women who are working, and you have to have proper sensitivities, and there cannot be any handicaps for women just because they are women. Then the journey went on to Air India versus Nargesh Mirza. Then we saw that that a particular provision was there which stipulated automatic termination of the service of an air hostess on her first pregnancy. So, come to think of, today we are talking about crashes. Initially, there were rules and stipulations in the service which prescribed that upon your first pregnancy, your services will be terminated. So Supreme Court struck down that provision also in Nargesh Mirza's case, and it went on to say that this is not just arbitrary but abhorrent to the notions of a civilized society. There were some cases where slowly the march went on. There were cases, you will also remember that the property rights for women were also not absolute in the beginning, and it was just the Stridhan that was recognized. Of course, that significant amendment came in the Indian Hindu Succession Act in 2005, which actually allowed the woman to hold the property, allowed her equal rights as a co-partner, which were not allowed to her in the beginning. And then in the recent judgment, 3 years back, Supreme Court has gone on to say in a judgment that woman can also be a karta. So the whole idea of a karta being a woman was completely unheard of in law, but not just the march has allowed her to have full rights of the property that she holds, but also that she could be a karta in a Hindu undivided family. Another line of judgments that we saw was women's right. She's a mother of a child. When she gives birth to a child, she keeps the child for 9 months in her womb. And it is so ironical that her name was insignificant as a natural guardian. She was not even recognized as a natural guardian of the child. And it was the father alone whose name was important, significant. And the official files would not move, whether it was, child's admission in the school or getting any benefits for the child, obtaining any passport, etc. for the child. It was the father's name all through and through. This was taken care of by the Supreme Court in Geeta Hariharan versus Reserve Bank of India, where the Supreme Court recognized the right of a woman as a natural guardian at par with father, and said that now if you see that initially all forms that we would fill up, we were only required to put father's name, but now, or husband's name, where whatever is applicable. But now we are required to put mother's names, and also from husband's name it has gone to spouse's name. So this has been a journey, very interesting like that. Another important landmark journey for women and gender justice under the Constitution has been with regard to her rights in the matrimony. We saw that in Shah Bano's judgment. Uniform Civil Code is still not there in our country, despite the Supreme Court having said so many times. But it is quite amazing to see that not just that, it's not other civil rights which are actually facing the brunt in this. It is just the matrimonial rights which continue to be governed by the personal laws of each person, and it's nobody else. It's unfortunate that when a client comes to our office, asking for advice on a matrimonial issue, We had to ask her what her religion was and under what religion she got married, because what the remedy is available to her is actually, it depends on what her religion is and under what religion she has gotten married. That continues to till date. But there were some significant provisions in law that were made. Section 125 of the CRPC was one such provision that was made, and the interpretation of application of section 125 for maintenance to Muslim women also came up for consideration before the Supreme Court for the first time in the 1970s in the Shah Banos judgment. And the Supreme Court went on to say that though the personal law may not have any provision of maintenance, because under the Muslim law, the provision of marriage is uh, it's considered as a contract, and meher is the price of that contract, and on meher is the only thing. So maintenance was not prescribed under the personal law. But the Supreme Court went on to say that Section 125 CRPC is not a civil provision, and therefore the benefit will go to Muslim women also. Of course, it is rather unfortunate to note that the government of the day decided to take away the benefit that was granted by the Supreme Court judgment, and said that actually brought a law, and that law actually says the nomenclature of that law is Protection of Muslim Women at the Time of Divorce Act, but it actually took away the protection that had been granted by the Supreme Court. This journey of rights in the matrimony took many twists and turns. In fact, there was another judgment of Sarla Mudgal, where the court was faced with a very peculiar position, and that peculiar position was that this man had actually married another lady during the subsistence of his first marriage by converting into Islam, because we all know that under the personal law, the Muslims are allowed 4 marriages, whereas bigamy it became illegal in the Hindu Marriage Act, long before, almost contemporaneously with our existence as a free republic country. So this man, who was married to a Hindu lady under the Hindu laws, decided to marry a second woman by converting into Islam, by taking the advantage of that gap in law, that the Hindu law did not permit a second marriage, but the Muslim law permitted up to 4 marriages, and therefore by converting, he converted and married another one. The Supreme Court said in Sarla Mudgal's case that they completely struck it down. They said this is not permissible, and during the subsistence of the first marriage, and if the lady is alive, then if somebody converts and marries, then that marriage will be void, and he could be booked under bigamy. Bigamy is an offense under the IPC. We saw that at all these points in time, whether it was the Shah Banos judgment, Sarla Mudgal's case, the Supreme Court went on to say that we must have uniform civil code. It has been so many years, but the Parliament must bring it, and they did not go to that extent, and said it is for the legislature to do. And but we say that, we highlight that it has to be done. It is there in the directive principles. It must be achieved. Nothing has happened, but we saw that the progress of law happened a little more in this direction with the coming of the Domestic Violence Act in 2005. Again, this is an act which is a hybrid act. It has civil as well as criminal connotations. It has civil as well as criminal remedies that are prescribed under this act. And this act has actually now become a huge savior and a huge succor for women who are governed by different personal laws, because this is not strictly a civil law, Domestic Violence Act. Therefore, the remedies that are there are available to all. We also saw the misuse of live-in relationships. In fact, Domestic Violence Act was for the first time that live-in relationships were recognized by law, by a statute. Prior to that, women who were in live-in relationships, or who were in long-term relationships without valid marriages, they also faced a lot of difficulty. But Supreme Court did not shun its eyes to it, and did not leave them in a lurch, even though there was no law on that, and the live-in relationships were not really protected and recognized under the law. Then also the court went on to say that marriages which are like relationships which are in the nature of marriage, then it will be presumed, if the parties are holding out to the world that they are living like husband and wife, then they will be taken to be that. And it is of course a rebuttable presumption, but that presumption will be drawn, and the lady in the relationship will be entitled to the benefits that the law prescribes for wives. So we saw that whole journey going on, and finally this journey took us to 5 years back, where in Saira Bano's case, triple talaq was struck down as being unconstitutional by the Constitution Bench of the Supreme Court. So this time it's heartening to note that in this journey, the Supreme Court initially kept a hands-off approach by in general law. They gave benefits to the women, but kept a hands-off approach. But in Saira Bano's judgment, that hands-off approach was gone, and the Supreme Court very categorically made it unconstitutional, the practice of triple talaq, and that is how it was recognized. Some of the other judgments in different lines and length of gender justice. Of course, we can't miss Vishaka's judgment. Vishaka's judgment was a judgment of 2006. This judgment is a landmark judgment for more than one reasons. I must give you a little background. This is from my state. Bhavri Devi was a Sathin who was working in a small village in Rajasthan, in rural Rajasthan. And Rajasthan has always been a very highly patriarchal, very highly male-oriented society. Bhavri Devi opposed some child marriages that were taking place in the village, in the upper community houses. And she was punished for stopping those marriages, because child marriage has been an offense for a long time in India. Of course, they continue to happen, but it is an offense under law. So these men of the higher community, they retaliated by subjecting her to gang rape. So this case, actually, the criminal trial went in a different direction, but an NGO from Rajasthan took up this matter of how women are so vulnerable, even in their workplaces when they are working. This case actually became a landmark because Supreme Court otherwise does not lay down law. It's not the job of the Supreme Court to lay down law. They declare the law to be unconstitutional if they find it to be so, or they affirm the constitutionality of the law. They may strike down particular provisions. They may strike down the entire law, but they will never lay down the law. That's the standard on which the judiciary works across the world. But in this case, a very interesting novel idea was found to say that because there is no law to curb sexual harassment of women at workplace, till a law is made by the parliament, till then the Supreme Court laid down those guidelines and said that these guidelines will be treated as a letter of law, as law itself, till a law is laid down by the parliament. So this judgment came into 1996, and the law came to be enacted much later, only in 2013. Then in some of the sexual offenses, some of the more heinous offenses against women, the Supreme Court has played a very, very pivotal role. We have, many of us have seen that movie of the recent movie of Priyanka, where she plays this acid attack victim, Lakshmi. Lakshmi's case was actually a very important case where the Supreme Court in 2006 laid down extensive guidelines to protect victims of acid attack, to provide for adequate compensation to them, so that it's very expensive for them to have all the skin grafting and medical procedures and all of that. So adequate compensation to cover all that was included. There were very stringent measures that were laid down to regulate the sale of acid. Before this, acid was available across the counter. Of course, its enforcement still continues to be a problem in India, like enforcement of all other laws. But strict guidelines were laid down to regulate the sale of acid, where it was made mandatory for shop owners to have an inventory of acid, who purchased, how much was purchased. Measure was laid down; it cannot be purchased more than that, and over the counter sale of acid was prohibited by the Supreme Court. In a lot of other cases also, wherever the Supreme Court has, wherever the Supreme Court saw that victims of sexual assault, victims of rape, victims of other heinous sexual offenses against the women, when they were coming into the system, whether it was initial medical examination where they were subjected to the humiliating and inhuman two-finger test, to their their statements being recorded, their examination and cross-examination. Even this case that I was mentioning of Bhanwari Devi, which led to the Vishakha guidelines, the account of Bhanwari Devi is that when she went to lodge the FIR, women in rural Rajasthan, they wear a long skirt, which is which called a lehenga. And she said that when I went to lodge the FIR, the police station, they kept my lehenga, saying that there is evidence on this and we need this lehenga for investigation. They did not even bother to see if the woman had anything else to wear to go back home, to go back to her village. And she says that she had to actually wrap around her husband's turban. Men also in rural Rajasthan, they wear these safas, which are headgears, long yard of cloth tied around their head. So she wrapped herself in the turban of her husband to as she walked back from the thana back to her village, back to her home. So this is the insensitivity with which victims of sexual assault and sexual abuse were being dealt with. In fact, they were made like these monsters. They were made like these accused and perpetrators of the crime rather than being treated as victims of the crime. So there also the constant chiding by the Supreme Court, constant accosting by the Supreme Court led to various measures where, now protecting the identity of the victim of a sexual assault is mandated by law, where, earlier Supreme Court at many occasions said that when the victim of sexual assault comes into the system for justice, what she goes through actually adds insult to her injury. She has already gone through the injury of sexual assault, but going through the system for justice is adding insult to that injury. The manner in which she was cross-examined, the manner in which her character was assassinated. So all this was put an end to and put a stop to, and now it is statutorily prescribed. After the Nirbhaya amendments, we saw a lot of amendments that came in the criminal law with regard to offences against women. And we saw a complete overhaul where all of these offences, initially it used to be perceived as if stalking, eve teasing. These are small, innocuous acts, and they're not really offences, and it is a done thing, and boys should be allowed to do this without facing the criminal law. But after the amendment in law, this has been recognized as criminal offences. Eve teasing, stalking, voyeurism, acid throwing, these are all recognized now as separate offences, and more interestingly, first time offenders, they are handed out a lesser punishment, but on a repeat offence the punishment is much higher. I'm just trying to see Sabrimala judgment, of course, also is a very important judgment. Those, now that the reviews are pending, it has gone on to be something that that two views are possible, and it is being debated because it is still open to be debated in the Supreme Court. But Sabrimala's judgment was a very important judgment which opened the floodgates for similar kind of litigation. So many other religious places which were closed for women, whether it was Shani Shignapur temple, whether it was Haji Ali Dargah, all of these places were open while the Sabrimala matter was pending for consideration. Another very interesting case, Buddhadev Kamaskar versus State of West Bengal. This is linked with the sexual offences case. The Supreme Court went on to say that even if the victim of sexual assault is a sex worker, then also her no means no. And it's not like because she's a sex worker by profession that she can be ravished by anybody anytime without her consent, and her no is also equally a no. So that is how the Supreme Court has dealt with many of these cases. Of course, now they've gone on to recognize the third gender also. Adultery is one line of judgments. In fact, it's not just the latest judgment of Joseph Shine versus Union of India Constitution Bench, where they struck down Section 497 and said that husband is not master of the wife. I will remind you all that the language of adultery under the IPC was, before it was struck down, was that it made it an offense against the husband if a person had sexual intercourse with his wife without the consent or connivance of the husband. So the whole premise of the section adultery was premised on husband being the master. I actually went to the background of how rape laws were understood, how these sexual offenses were understood. And before 18th century, rape was not taken as a offense against the woman. It was understood that rape is an offense either against the father if the lady is unmarried, or against the husband if the lady is married. And it was taken as a highest violation of property, because woman was considered as the property of the father or the property of the husband. Things changed, and after the 18th century, we saw self-determination of women taking the center stage, and judiciary has been pivotal in playing a very efficacious and effective role in ensuring that actual gender justice becomes the reality of the day, and not just theoretical aspects which exist in the constitution. So the journey of adultery is also very interesting, because prior to this having been struck down, on 3 occasions the validity of adultery was considered by the Supreme Court in the decades of 1960s and 1970s. And the perspective at that time was whether, at one time it was whether it should be taken as an offense only against the husband, whether it could be an offense against the, against the wife itself, whether the woman could be taken as an accomplice or a co-accused in this. Because if she is a consenting party in a relationship outside her marriage, then she fulfills the requirements of being an accomplice or a co-accused or an abettor to the crime. But the Supreme Court did not hold it to be that. Of course, like I said, the interpretation of Constitution has been so dynamic that what was found to be perfectly all right in the decades of 1960s and 70s was ultimately overturned in just 2 years back, and incidentally also by a bench, by a judgment which is authored by Justice Dhananjay Chandrachud, whereas one of the earlier judgments was of his father, Justice D.Y. Chandrachud. So that is how this journey has been. I must also, we are also running with short of time, but I must mention this one judgment that I have been part of, and I have actually, had the honor and privilege of representing some of the very courageous women officers of the Indian Army, Indian Air Force, and the Indian Navy, where their battle for permanent commission in the forces, their battle for command roles, and these positions were. We got a judgment recently on the 17th of February 2020 was the Army judgment, and in the first in the second week of March was the naval judgment. The Air Force cases are still pending, but the Army and the Navy judgments are incredible. This is the Secretary, Ministry of Defense versus Babita Punia, which is the Army judgment, and Annie Nagaraj, Union of India versus Annie Nagaraj is the naval judgment. These judgments are instrumental, and they take it completely a leap forward and become an important milestone for gender justice and its interpretation and implementation under our constitution. Because what the Supreme Court has very clearly recognized in these judgments is that it is the mindset that is the problem. The Supreme Court goes on to say that it is the stereotypical mindset, and equality for gender is actually fighting the stereotypes in the system and nothing else. Because otherwise, these women have been performing in the Indian Air Force, Indian Army, and Indian Navy since 1992, and their services had been recognized as exemplary. They had been given gallantry awards. Gallantry awards are not awards that come in peacetime. Gallantry awards are awards that are given by the forces in wartime or war-like situations. So this judgment became a very, very watershed moment for gender justice, and all the kinds of excuses that were thrown in on behalf of the Army administration, I would say, despite a decision having been taken at the highest level in the political arena, the Prime Minister of our country, announced this from the ramparts of the Red Fort in 2018, 15th August 2018. Still, in execution, all kinds of discrimination was being piled up, including not allowing women the command roles, the command positions, not giving this benefit to them at par with gentlemen officers, not giving them these the benefits to women who had been fighting for this. So the Supreme Court has completely struck down all of them and put the onus on the Union of India to have a practice which is dignified to gender and completely equal to gender, and recognizing the pivotal role that women as soldiers have played for national security. So that really completes. I think, of course, there would be many that I've not covered. I've tried to cover whatever I could in this to take you through the whole journey of how gender justice has been very strongly protected by the Supreme Court. Thank you very much. Thank you for listening. With so much of patience, I'm open to any interactions.
Thank you, Ms. Aishwarya. Short and sweet talk, and it touches almost all the important judgments covering the field. And I have only one question to ask straight. So, can you just say in which area or field or ground in which you can say that gender justice completely achieved, nothing remains to be achieved? And contra to that, in one area where you find it is not even contemplated or it's not even achieved, there is a huge difference between men and women. Can you pinpoint these two extremes? One extreme, it is achieved totally. Another is it is not even fully achieved, or only partially achieved or partly achieved.
Sir, I don't think there is any area where the work is complete.
Yeah.
I think in every area the work continues. This is work in progress. We can't sit on our laurels. Of course, huge leaps have been made. Huge leaps have been made by women themselves. And the society has recognized that, and those leaps have been taken forward. But till the time women continue to struggle for basic safety, basic security in the public spaces, it's not about empowering women in any way. It's just that we need to stop seeing women as liabilities and we have to start seeing them as assets. Because if one half of our population cannot contribute to nation building, to society building, to family building, to the best of her capacity, then it is a loss to everyone. It is not her loss alone. Some women have still made very important inroads into male bastions, but those are still women of individual examples of excellence rather than as a class women breaking the glass ceilings. That's what I feel, sir.
Understand. But what about the progress or inroads made by women in the judiciary? I mean, as an appointment of judges, elevation of judges. Do you think they're sufficiently represented in the higher echelons of the judiciary, like high courts and Supreme Court?
Sir, I feel they are not sufficiently represented in higher echelons of any walk of life. In the number that they exist, individual cases of excellence, yes. But not as a class, as the number that they really ought to be. But this is, we will be wrong if we look at just the top, because you can't have women descending on the top, women who have not come in through the struggle, who have not gone in through the grind, and those women will actually be counterproductive if they are paratroop from on the top. They have to be brought in from the grind. When I got designated as a senior last year, I realized that there only 12 women have been designated by the Supreme Court in 70 years plus.
Yes, yeah.
There are not enough, and it's not like the systems are biased. It's the whole structure. It's always easy for the lady to fall back. It's always easy for her to take care of the family. Any problem, she should take a back seat. Any problem, she's expected to do this. She should not be professionally ambitious. That's the expectation. But we need more now. More and more young girls are taking to the profession. I'm sure when this generation of young girls in plenty number, when they rise up in the profession, then there will be enough choices for women to rise up in higher echelons also.
Of course. As an individual, we see that a lot of achievers are there in women. But as a class, as you said, they have long ways to go. And the question in the chat box, one Mr. Ilakya Armugam must be Miss also. What's your opinion about women's right of abortion? Is it absolute? Is there any still exists gender discrimination in the matter of abortion?
Thankfully in India, under our laws, the right of women for abortion is not curtailed. In fact, I was surprised to know that Nepal did not have any right of abortion to the woman. It was unconstitutional till they had this constitution just 4 or 5 years back. Nepal now has a new constitution. Before that, there was no right of abortion. And there was a huge debate that was going on in Nepal that whether that abortion should be with the consent of the man, who would be the father of that of the child in the womb. So that right was curtailed there also, that it has to the right of self-determination, the right of sexual autonomy and reproductive autonomy has to be of the woman, and it is her voice that has to be given complete primacy in a issue of abortion. That is how it is recognized in the Indian laws. But in practice, what happens is completely different. Of course, there's a huge gap that needs to be filled in practice and theory.
That's a good answer. And may I now request Mr. Parthiban to ask his questions to Ms. Aishwarya. Parthiban?
Yes. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you for the wonderful webinar.
Thank you.
Am I audible?
Yes, yes.
You can ask him.
Well, the intercourse based on a false promise to marry will amount to rape, because there is two controversial judgments from Supreme Court. One says it's rape and one is not. So I need your view about that, ma'am.
Well, the statute actually says that sexual intercourse under the promise of marriage is a rape. So till that changes, there will really be no change. Of course, this has become more controversial because now the reality of the society is also something that the courts have to take cognizance of. If you see that now there are live-in relationships that go on for years, sometimes decades, and after being in a live-in relationship for years and decades, charges of rape have been leveled by the women. So to balance out the reality of the society, and there it cannot be. I mean, it will, in a crime, it will always depend on the facts and circumstances of each case. But it cannot be that the lady has, allowed sexual intercourse or sexual relations to be made only on the pretext of marriage. If she has lived in a live-in relationship, had a relationship for years altogether, then she is conscious of what she's going through. So that's why crime, for a crime to be established, I think Supreme Court is balancing it out very well, considering that the statute still, prescribes a sexual relationship under the promise of marriage to be an offense. I think the Supreme Court is balancing it quite well.
Thank you, ma'am.
We now request Mr. Manigandan.
Yes, ma'am. Ma'am, thank you for this opportunity. And we are speaking about adultery, and what we said before is after marriage also there will be adultery happened. Rape means after marriage, husband and wife is living smoothly, but not living understandingly. It means after marriage, he hurted many more, and the wife got injured by a backbone injury, and he got operated. That woman got operated, and on that time itself, she gave birth to a small child, boy child, and that operation was held cesarean. And after that, he got well. That body got well, and when he recovered from that injury, afterwards, that husband, he tried to make a divorce. Now the wife is going only for sexual satisfaction. How it will be treated, as whether it is adultery or not, ma'am?
I actually did not gather the question properly, but if I could just explain, adultery has just been declared unconstitutional in the IPC. It continues to be a matrimonial wrong, it continues to be a civil wrong, and it continues to be a partial criminal law under the Domestic Violence Act. Only it does not attract the IPC. And I feel that women continue to live in abusive marriages marital rape. There is a whole debate now going on that marital rape should be declared as an offense, and that exception in the definition of rape under section 375, there's an exception which is the relationship of a husband with his wife. Of course, there also the age was initially lower, but in the independent thought judgment of 2 years back of Justice Lokur, they've said that it has to be at par, 18 years. But matrimony, you can't put into the matrimony too many criminal rights, because so long as there is love between the parties, they will be governed by no law. But as soon as the love goes out of the door, the law comes in from the window. So, but it's not like women do not have options. They have rights and remedies available to them. They continue to live in abusive marriages because of social stigma or economic dependence. So till the time we are not able to address those issues, there will be no real change. I hope I understood. I could not really understand too well.
I understood, ma'am. But what my question is, the girl in that smaller age, he's not getting advice of the parents and advocates also. In that smaller age, what she decided is she wants to get rejoined with the husband. In this position, the husband is going to harass her repeatedly. What we can do that? Whether
Sir, you can advise the lady that there is, even if the parents and lawyers she's not able to have access to, under the Domestic Violence Act, there are protection officers that are designated for every district, and those protection officers can actually help her to integrate if she wants to live with her husband, nobody can stop her. She's entitled to do that, but she has to have a minimum level of protection, and also let her know that now legal aid is statutorily provided under the 1987 Act. Now legal aid is available across every district court in the country. In fact, many municipal courts also have legal aid clinics, and their lawyers and legal advice and consultation is available free of charge for women and children.
But the husband is completely in a harassing mood only and harassing mind only. He's going to divorce and he's going to remarry with another wife. What we can make
but sir, that's not a decision for you and me to make. That is a decision for the wife to make. She has to realize this. Where if she wants to live with him, then nobody can stop her. If she does not want to live with him, then nobody can force her. She has to see that it's a cruel relationship and she should not get into it. It can't be your judgment and my judgment.
No, whether we can, as an advocate, we can file any complaint against the husband. No, not possible.
No, sir. If it is a physical violence that is happening, then you can report. But that's
already it was happened, ma'am. Physical violence already it was happened.
You can lodge a complaint under the Domestic Violence Act, but if she does not support it, your complaint will be thrown off.
Okay. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you. There is a question again. Once again, it reads to the relating to the false complaint given by some of the women by either abusing or misusing the law. They say, what is the remedy available to the innocent victims who have done no wrong at all, where the false complaints are given by women, either at the instigation of the advocate or by relatives?
This is a huge problem, sir, that we are seeing, and this is a problem that even the Supreme Court has taken cognizance of. There are many judgments where Supreme Court has gone on to say that matrimonial laws, especially the dowry-related laws, cruelty-related laws, are amongst the most abused provisions of law these days. It is unfortunate that they are being abused, but the only remedy that is available against the abuse is the court of law. It is supposed to be the court of law which is to remove the shaft from the grain. And unfortunately, what is happening these days is that false sections are being added. Even 376 sections are being added against brother-in-laws, father-in-laws. 377 is being added against husband, etc. There are too many false cases that are happening. And I think as lawyers, we also need to introspect a little and realize what has been our role into this. When clients come to us for matrimonial advice and matrimonial issues, I think it's important for us to deal with it with the sensitivity that it should be dealt with, and not in a cruel manner and say, okay, you have a dispute, come, we'll do 5 cases and we'll do all these allegations, because when you come to court, you have to make those allegations. I mean, there are occasions where we have seen that women have said before the courts that I did not know what my Vakil Sahab was writing. My Vakil Sahab has written so many things in the petition, but they're not really true. So it's important for all of us to realize our role. What is at stake is the institution of family. The institution of marriage protects the institution of family, and even if parties don't want to live together, if they have fallen out, then also we should, as lawyers, try and help them to come to, agree to disagree. Either agree to agree or agree to disagree, but do it as amicably as possible.
Thank you, Anita. One more question I want to ask you. It relates to the procedure followed in case of obtaining divorce. See, in case if the act is amended, irrespective of personal law, and irretrievable broken down marriage is made as a ground of divorce, is it advantageous for a woman to get it done easily without any damage being done, or without mudslinging each other and without need to prove any allegation? That be the case, we will not go to the extent of putting allegations against each other by giving false statement and giving room for the advocates to write long and lengthy pleadings without even consulting the clients. Could it be an advantage for a woman to have such a ground under the law? Though it is common to both, will it be advantageous to the woman?
I understand your question. Irretrievable breakdown of marriage is ultimately the future that we have to imbibe. Marriages we cannot have criminal aspects going into. My Hindu law professor used to tell that having too many laws in a marriage is like having a bull in the china shop. You can't have work it that way. So ultimately, it has to be a no fault theory, and irretrievable breakdown has to be there. But the reason why it has not been included so far is actually to protect the women, because it is not a right that can be given just to women. It has to be a right that has to be given for both sides. And if it is given for both sides, the realities of our country are so strange that if we see the matrimonial columns in a newspaper or any website, all men are earning handsomely. They're working well and they're earning handsome salaries. But as soon as a maintenance application is filed, everyone becomes a pauper. All their properties go into the mother's name or father's name or brother's name, and they own no property. They're out of jobs. They're out of salaries. So there's no fairness in division of matrimonial assets. There is no security for women. So if easy exit is given, to men, especially out of these bad marriages or abusive marriages, without protecting the financial interests of women, because in our society, it's still like women are the caregivers in the home. They're not, they don't earn, but they're in abroad. What we see is, whoever has purchased whatever, all property which is matrimonial property is equally divided into two. And that property cannot be hidden. It's not like in India that you hide that in somebody's name and hide this in somebody's name. It's all there. So the contribution of the woman in just being the caregiver or just being a housewife also is taken as a 50% contribution in the matrimony. So it's not so easy. I think if we have that as a remedy today, without addressing these parallel issues, women will be at more disadvantage than getting actually benefited out of it.
Okay. So if you are asked to give an advice to the younger woman of the day, present day woman, will it be saying, kudos, come on, enjoy the rides and go ahead, or will you just give a rider or a little bit of a concern and a caution to them that be careful, khabardar? Which you would prefer to do?
Sir,
if I'm not inquisitive.
No, not at all. I think women have incredible motivation. They are doing well. They are coming up in all walks of life. But I think my advice will not be different for women than it will be different for young men. I think we complement each other. We complete each other. Family cannot be complete without men and women both. Equally so, society and nations cannot be complete without men and women both. And we all need to become part of the solution rather than becoming part of the problems. And I will quote two sentences from Nani Palkhiwala. He says, when he talks about rights and responsibilities, he says, "It is true that eternal vigilance is the price of liberty, but it is true in even a deeper sense that eternal responsibility is also a price of liberty.
Oh.
He says excessive authority without liberty is intolerable, but excessive liberty without authority and without responsibility soon become equally intolerable. And he cautions, liberty has a hypnotizing sound, so all our youngsters get attracted to it. He says liberty has a hypnotizing sound, while unfortunately responsibility has no sex appeal. So let's go with both. Balance is the key, is what I feel, sir.
Exactly. A beautiful take-home message. And I think the youngsters will take the clue from you and march off. Let them march ahead. And thank you, Formula. I think for the time spent with us and the deliberations made with reference to case laws and for the wonderful Sunday morning. Thank you very much.
Thank you so very much, sir. It was a wonderful morning that I had with all of you. So grateful that you had me. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thank you.